The night was cold, colder than any winter wind had the right to be. It sliced through the small cabin like a knife, carrying with it the bite of 1,000 miles of open prairie. In the flickering firelight, the shadows danced, long and restless. The old log walls creaked under the pressure of the wind, but it was the cry of the baby that filled the air with the most unbearable weight. Etta clutched the infant to her chest, rocking gently, though there was little comfort to be found in the motion. The baby's wail was a sharp, desperate sound, cutting through the quiet night, like the howl of wolves. Every cry broke a little more of her heart, but her strength was fading. The night was thick with the sting of the cold, the fire pit barely keeping the darkness at bay. Etta's mind drifted to darker places, a past that had been a long time coming, a life she'd tried to forget. She wasn't always here in this cold, rickety cabin. She had once been a part of a world that offered comfort and warmth. But now it was as though the very earth beneath her had turned its back, and even the wind whispered cruel secrets about the woman she had become. The town had already made its judgment. She had never been one for gossip, but when the whispers reached her ears, they carried a weight too heavy to ignore. A woman out of place, a woman with a child, a woman whose husband had disappeared in the dead of night, leaving only the stains of betrayal on the dusty streets. No one knew the full story, but the suspicion, the shame, was enough to cast her out. And the baby, her precious child, was now the symbol of that shame, her existence a constant reminder of her fall from grace. She could feel the air pulling tight around her chest, the fire struggling to hold back the cold. But it was the sound of her baby's cry that brought her to her knees. She wrapped her arms around the small body, feeling the tiny hands struggle, the warmth seeping out with every second. Her fingers brushed against her coat, the one remaining piece of her once cherished life, the coat her husband had worn when he left her to face the world alone. The fabric, soft and worn, was now a shield against the world's gaze. But tonight, it felt like it wasn't enough. "Please, just quiet now," Etta whispered, as if speaking to the wind, as if pleading with the gods for mercy. But nothing answered, save for the relentless howl of the cold and the baby's wail. Outside, the wind howled through the prairie, but somewhere beyond the snow, something stirred, a shadow in the distance, moving closer, slowly, as if drawn by the sound of the baby's cry. She couldn't tell if it was real, or just her mind playing tricks on her in the depths of her exhaustion. But that shadow, it lingered. And then, through the dim window, a silhouette appeared against the horizon, and Etta's heart raced. It couldn't be. It was just the wind. The night played tricks, didn't it? The baby's cries grew louder, and the door creaked under the strain of the storm. In that moment, Etta's breath caught in her throat. Someone was outside. Someone had heard. The wind howled, and then just as quickly, it stopped. There was silence. A long, terrible silence that carried the weight of something unspoken. The door burst open, and a tall figure stepped inside, wrapped in a coat too fine for these parts. The wind had stopped, but the cold remained. The stranger's eyes, sharp as knives, met Etta's, and the world shifted. The man who stepped inside was a stranger to the world Etta had known. His boots were polished to a gleam, the kind of gleam that only comes from gold dust and polished leather, not from the dirt and sweat of real hard work. His coat was made of the finest fur, draped across his broad shoulders with a grace that belied the roughness of the prairie. His face was hard and weathered, eyes a piercing blue that seemed to read straight through her. But it was his presence, the air of someone who owned everything in his path, yet stood there, in her humble cabin, that unsettled her most. For a moment, Etta couldn't move. The wind outside howled again, as if urging him to step forward, to do something, anything. But the man stood there, watching her with that intense gaze, his chest rising and falling with every breath he took. His face, though hardened by years of riding and fighting, softened for just a second when his eyes landed on the baby in her arms. Etta hadn't expected anyone to come. Not now, not like this. She had thought her life was over, buried beneath the weight of her shame and the isolation that came with it. But there he was, in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the darkened night. "Is that your child?" His voice was rough, low, but there was a strange gentleness in it, a tenderness that didn't belong to the man standing before her. Etta nodded slowly, still too stunned to speak. She had no idea who this man was, but she couldn't deny that there was something in his eyes that called to her, something familiar, something human. "My name's Reese Holloway," he said, stepping closer. "I own the Holloway Ranch on the far side of the river. And you're the woman they call a witch." Etta flinched at the word. Witch. It hung in the air like smoke, thick and choking. Her fingers tightened around her baby, the weight of that accusation hanging over her like a dark cloud. "You're wrong," she whispered, almost to herself. I'm not a witch." But Reese didn't answer her right away. Instead, he removed his coat with a deliberate slowness, his eyes never leaving her. The thick fur cascaded down his back, and for a brief moment, Etta caught a glimpse of a brand on his shoulder, a faded symbol of something long forgotten. "You're cold," he said simply, draping his coat over her shoulders before she could protest. The warmth of the coat was a relief, but it was more than just warmth. It was an offering, an unspoken promise that someone with power, with a name, with a story, had heard her, had seen her. But even as the coat settled over her shoulders, the baby continued to cry, its wails cutting through the silence like a knife. "I've heard the stories," Reese continued, his voice softening as he lowered himself to one knee in front of her. "People are saying your husband left you, that he took off with another woman, and that the baby, well, it's a curse, a reminder of your dishonor." Etta's heart twisted, but she refused to let the tears come. She had heard those stories too, the whispers that followed her everywhere, the way the townsfolk looked at her when they thought she wasn't looking. But there was something in Reese's eyes now, something that made her wonder if, just maybe, he wasn't like the others. "My husband didn't leave me for another woman," Etta said, her voice low but fierce. "He left me because I didn't fit into his life anymore. He left me because I was too much for him to handle." She paused, swallowing hard against the lump in her throat. "But I'm not a witch. I'm not cursed." Reese said nothing, but there was a flicker in his eyes, something that suggested he might just believe her. He reached out and gently touched the baby's tiny hand, his rough fingers brushing against the soft skin. The baby's cries quieted just for a moment, as if sensing the calm presence of the man in front of her. "Let me help," he said, his voice so quiet that it almost felt like a prayer. I know what it's like to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. And I know what it's like to be judged before you even get a chance to prove yourself. Etta's heart beat faster. She didn't know what to make of him. This stranger, with his fine clothes, his gentle touch, and his words that sounded like he understood. But she also knew that this was the first time in a long while that someone had offered her help without asking for anything in return. And for that, she was grateful. The days that followed were slow and full of tension. A strange peace settling over the cabin, as if the storm outside had somehow passed through Etta's heart. Rhys stayed for a while, not saying much, but never leaving her side. He helped chop firewood, built a new fire pit, and mended the cabin's leaky roof with the skill of someone who had seen far more than his share of rough winters. But even in the quiet moments, there was a weight hanging in the air, something unspoken between them, as though they both understood the fragility of the situation. Etta kept her distance, never quite sure whether Rhys's kindness was genuine or born out of a sense of duty. The rumors about her, the ones that followed her everywhere she went, never stopped. The accusations, the glances, the way people turned away when she entered a room. The townsfolk called her everything from a witch to a fallen woman, but the word that hurt the most was betrayer. Her husband's disappearance still lingered like a dark stain on her name. The law hadn't cared to investigate, and no one had dared to ask the right questions. Instead, they simply whispered and looked the other way when her name was spoken. She had learned to ignore the whispers, but there were times, like now, when they felt like a weight on her chest, an invisible rope pulling her down into a pit of shame. The baby had grown quiet in her arms, as if sensing her turmoil, and though she tried to calm him, her own heart was in pieces. One evening, just after the sun had dipped below the horizon and the fire flickered low, Rhys came to her with a strange look in his eyes. He had been gone for a few hours, and when he returned, his expression was somber, as if he carried news that would change everything. "Etta," he said, his voice steady, "I spoke to the sheriff today." Her heart sank. She knew what that meant. She had heard the stories. The sheriff, a man with a reputation for enforcing the law without mercy, had been one of the loudest voices in the town when it came to condemning her. "What did he say?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "He says you've got no place here anymore," Rhys replied, his eyes hardening, the lines around his mouth tightening. "That you're a danger to the town, that you've cursed this land." Etta felt the breath leave her body. She had known it was coming, but hearing it out loud was a different kind of blow. The isolation, the fear, it all felt like it was closing in on her, wrapping around her throat. "Are you going to let them run me out of here?" Her words were sharp, cutting through the silence. "I've done nothing to deserve this." Rhys didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped closer, taking a deep breath before speaking again. "I don't believe the rumors. I don't believe what they say about you, Etta. But the town doesn't care about what's true. They care about what's convenient. And right now, it's convenient for them to see you as the scapegoat." His words were harsh, but there was a sadness in them, a sadness that mirrored her own. She looked down at the baby in her arms, the child who had done nothing wrong, yet whose existence had become the focal point of every whispered accusation. The fire crackled between them, the only sound filling the oppressive silence that stretched out in front of them. Etta could feel the weight of his gaze on her, but it didn't offer her the comfort she had hoped for. Instead, it reminded her of the chasm between them. The chasm that was made of broken promises, betrayal, and the relentless cruelty of the world. The baby stirred in her arms, the small hands curling around her finger, and Etta closed her eyes for a moment, finding solace in the warmth of his tiny body. She had to survive. She had to protect him. But how could she do that when the world was so intent on tearing her apart? "I'll fight them," she said, her voice low, filled with determination. "I won't let them take him from me." Reese's face softened, but his eyes were still wary. "You're not alone in this, Etta. I'm with you. But we'll need more than just a fight. We'll need a way to make them see the truth. And I think I know how we can do that." He didn't say more, but the firelight danced in his eyes, and for the first time in a long while, Etta felt the stirrings of hope. A fragile thing, but enough to keep her moving forward. The next day, the wind carried the scent of dust and the weight of judgment. It had been days since Reese had spoken to the sheriff, and the quiet before the storm felt like the calmest kind of danger. Etta didn't know what Reese had planned, but she knew it had something to do with the strange glint in his eyes when he'd spoken of fighting for her. She wasn't sure if she could trust it, but what choice did she have? The town would not let her live in peace, not when they had decided that her very existence was a stain upon their community. As Reese had said, the people didn't care about truth. They cared about stories. And in the stories they told about Etta, she was the villain, the woman whose betrayal had poisoned everything. The baby was the living proof of that betrayal, a mark that would never fade. The sun was setting when Reese returned to the cabin. His boots kicked up the earth with a hard step, but his face was grim. It wasn't a look of victory. Not yet. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice calm, but there was a tension in the way he held himself, as if preparing for a fight that wasn't his to win. Etta nodded slowly. She hadn't said much, but in her silence, she knew what she had to do. The town wouldn't stop until they had their way. They wanted her gone, and she was willing to do whatever it took to hold on to the life she had left. For herself, for the baby. Reese motioned for her to follow, and she did, without a word. As they walked, the weight of the day's decisions hung over her like a storm cloud, heavy and suffocating. They made their way toward the town square, a place that had always felt foreign to her, a place where the gossip and the accusations burned hotter than any fire. When they reached the center of town, Etta felt the eyes on her. The same eyes that had once looked away now burned with judgment. Women whispered behind their hands, children pointed as she passed. The sheriff stood in the center, his broad figure like a pillar of the town's false righteousness. The crowd was silent, expectant. The sheriff's face hardened when he saw Etta, but his eyes flickered to Reese for just a moment, as if uncertain of what the man's presence meant. Reese stepped forward, his gaze steady as he addressed the crowd. Etta is no witch. She is no curse. She's a woman, and she has been wronged. The crowd murmured, but the sheriff didn't flinch. "What are you doing here, Holloway? This is none of your business?" Reese didn't answer the sheriff directly, but instead turned toward Etta. "Tell them what happened, Etta," he said softly, his voice carrying just enough weight to make her heart beat faster. "Tell them the truth." Etta looked out over the crowd, her breath catching in her chest. The eyes of the townsfolk, the whispers, the cold glares. They were all around her now, as they had been for so long. But she wouldn't be silent anymore. Not today. With a deep breath, Etta stepped forward, her voice trembling at first, but growing steadier with every word. "I didn't betray anyone," she said, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "My husband left me, and he left our child. He abandoned us when we needed him most. He's gone, and no one knows why. But the town, they've decided I'm the one who is to blame. They've marked me, branded me with their lies." The sheriff's face twisted with contempt, but Etta held his gaze. "I am not the one they say I am. I'm a mother, and I will do whatever it takes to protect my son." Her words hung in the air like smoke, settling over the crowd. The silence was deafening. It was then that the small crack of defiance she had been waiting for came, a child's voice, soft but clear, cutting through the tension. "She's not a witch. I saw her once, helping my mother with the sick cow." The child, no older than 6, called out from the edge of the crowd. "She didn't hurt anyone. She helped." For a brief moment the crowd went still. The sheriff's face darkened, but the murmurs spread like wildfire. A few other voices joined in, reluctant but firm. "She helped my family, too. She's just a woman trying to survive." Etta's heart raced. It was so small, so fragile, but it was enough. Enough to shift the tide, enough to crack open the hardened shell of the town's hatred. And then, through the silence, Reese moved forward, his hand resting on Etta's shoulder. "This town can either stand with her, or it can stand against her," he said. "But if you cast her out, you cast me out too." The sheriff's face reddened, but he said nothing. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of wind rustling through the dusty street. The tension in the air could have snapped, but Reese's words had planted a seed, and the truth was beginning to take root, no matter how small or fragile it was. The next few days were strange, filled with an unsettling quiet that stretched over the town like a blanket. The people, once eager to condemn, now walked with their heads down, avoiding Etta's gaze. The gossip that had once seemed so loud and insistent began to fade, swallowed up by the weight of her words and the quiet defiance that had grown in the cracks of her broken reputation. The town wasn't completely free of suspicion, not by a long shot, but the weight of judgment had lifted, if only just a little. Reese stayed close. His presence, at first so foreign and unsettling, became a constant. Not a promise of victory, but a reminder that not all men were like the ones who had condemned her. He didn't speak much of the confrontation at the town square, but there was a change in the way the townsfolk looked at him now. Some watched with curiosity, others with resentment, but none of them dared challenge him openly. Etta spent her days with the baby, the sound of his laughter slowly filling the air again. The cold had loosened its grip on the world, and though the scars of the past remained, she could feel the faint stirrings of something different, something like hope. One evening, as the sun sank low over the prairie, and the chill of the coming night settled in, Etta stood by the fire, cradling the baby in her arms. The warmth from the flames was a welcome relief, but her mind wandered, still tangled with the memory of those final moments in the town square. Reese approached, his boots quiet against the ground. He had been away for a few hours, dealing with some business at his ranch. But there was something in the way he walked that made Etta's heart beat a little faster. He had always been distant, in a way, that made her unsure. But tonight, the space between them seemed smaller. He stood by the fire, looking out at the horizon, his eyes distant as the orange glow of the sunset bathed the land in soft light. "You did it," he said quietly, almost to himself. "You made them listen." Etta didn't respond at first, unsure of how to put into words what had happened. She hadn't won, not in any grand sense, but something had shifted. The town had seen her, really seen her, for the first time, and in that small crack of defiance, she had found something that no one could take away from her. "I didn't do it alone," Etta said, her voice soft but steady. "You helped me. You gave me a chance to speak." Reese turned to face her, his gaze unwavering. For a moment the world felt still, as if nothing existed but the two of them standing there by the fire. The baby cooed softly in her arms, the light of the flames casting flickers of warmth over her face. "You've been through more than most folks can ever understand," Reese said, his voice low and rough, like a man who had lived a life full of unspoken things. "But you've survived, and that's something no one can take away from you." Etta's heart clenched. There was a tenderness in his words that made her chest ache. It wasn't the grand gestures, the promises of rescue, but the quiet acknowledgement that survival, true survival, was something earned. She looked down at the baby, the small, perfect face framed by the soft folds of her coat. It was his warmth that had kept her going through the darkest moments. The hope that he would never know the cruelty of the world that had nearly consumed her. "I don't know what comes next," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "but I know I'm not alone anymore." Reese stepped closer, his hand brushing gently against her arm, and the touch was enough to make her breath catch. He didn't say anything more, but the look in his eyes spoke louder than words ever could. They stood there, side by side, the wind still howling in the distance, but the cold was nothing compared to the warmth they shared. It wasn't a triumph, not in the way she had once imagined it. There were no grand victories or sweeping gestures, but there was something far more valuable, a quiet, earned survival, and the promise that no matter what came next, they would face it together. And in that moment, under the wide open sky, Etta realized that she had reclaimed something far more precious than her name or her reputation. She had reclaimed her right to live, to choose what came next, and to stand tall in a world that had once tried to break her. As the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the land, the first stars began to twinkle in the night sky, distant but steady. Etta held her baby close, and for the first time, in what felt like forever, she breathed in the cool, fresh air, knowing that she had survived, and that, in itself, was enough.